Hey everyone, thank you for coming to our presentation. My name is Marco Seiferle-Valencia, and this is my co-presenter, Jylisa Kenyon. Go ahead and throw up that slide deck whenever you're ready, Jylisa. It looked like it came up and now it's gone away. But while that loads up, I'll just tell you our title. We are Indigenous Voices and the Crabtree Collection, a case study in creating spaces for Indigenous perspectives. So we are joining you from the University of Idaho, where we are both librarians at the University of Idaho Library. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Jylisa. Great. So this is just a little outline for today's talk. We're going to talk about backstory, grant components. I just want to make sure someone unmuted. Let me just double check here. We are flying without a conference moderator, so I'm just double checking. If you can just double check your background mic, I definitely have like super hearing, so I won't get distracted. Okay, perfect. So our outline for today's talk, a backstory of why we're here, who we are, and what we're doing, a little bit about the grant that this project is originating out of, our brief introduction into our conception of counterstory, with the caveat that neither of us are experts in that area, so it's definitely an area in which we're reaching out in this effort. What we're doing with our advisory board as an intentional counterstory space. The trouble with advisory boards generally is maybe they've been conceived in some approaches so far, revised approach to an advisory board, and thinking about application for this beyond our Crabtree project, so this specific grant. So let's go ahead and do our introductions for ourselves. Jylisa, why don't you dive in and say a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from?
Awesome. Thanks, Marco. As Marco mentioned, my name is Jylisa Kenyon. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the social sciences librarian at the University of Idaho. So the reason why I became involved in this grant project is because I liaise with the Department of Culture, Society, and Justice, which includes sociology and anthropology. So that's why I'm involved in this project, because we are working with the Alfred W. Bowers Laboratory of Anthropology to digitize one of their collections. In working through this grant project, I've been seeking new ways to expand my knowledge, my cultural competency, and my understanding with a lot of these theories and frameworks and concepts that are really important for us as we seek to center the Native and Indigenous perspectives that are embedded but completely hidden and at times disregarded within this collection in past work and in current conversations surrounding that. So I'm really engaged and interested in investigating and applying these ideas and frameworks, but I'm definitely still a beginner when it comes to this type of work.
Thanks, Jylisa. Great introduction. I'm Marco Seiferle-Valencia. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the open education librarian and the manager of a space called the Gary Strong Curriculum Center. That's a K through 12 education center / library in our College of Education. I'm also the co-creator of something called the Chicana por Mi Raza Digital Memory Collective. This is a distributed grassroots archive that collects feminist histories, specifically from Chicanas, Latinx people, and other femme identifying people in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So it's an oral history project, it's a digital archive, and it's also an intentional space of feminist praxis in digital archival space. So some of the concepts that we're working with on the Crabtree grant are not new to me exactly, but this is a different context. And this is certainly the most formal context that I've gotten to apply them in terms of institutional support. So I am from Northwest New Mexico. I am a Chicano native and also a white settler. And so this project has been very interesting for me in negotiating my different identities and some of my imposter syndrome in various spaces. So it's been really helpful for me to practice some of the things that I try to teach folks and get some applied experience. So we also want to tell you a little bit about our grant team. We have a team of 3 student employees, as well as our digitization manager, Allison Fashing. Leah Evans-Younker is our co-PI on this project, and she is the collections manager of the Crabtree Collection. We also have Lee Sappington, who's an emeritus professor of anthropology at the University of Idaho, and he's been helping us with metadata creation. Tim Mace is a staff member who has been helping us with our 3D digitization and other like 3D printing specifically. And then Jylisa and I round out the team from the library, which is me and her. So Jylisa, Leah, and myself are the PIs on this grant. And then over on our photos here, we have Jess up top, Chloe, sorry, I always mispronounce that name, Chloe, and then Leah, excuse me, Savannah, Jess, and Chloe. Sorry, I'm misreading while I'm trying to look at pictures. And also, if you're wondering, that is Viper, the service dog. That's Jess's service animal. So this is our team that we've been working with on this project. I am the only Native person on this project in any capacity, and I feel that I am not representing any specific tribe, as I do not have tribal enrollment, and I am also not actually acting in that capacity in this role. But I joined this effort with a specific goal of trying to counter story and trouble this collection. It was important to me that if the library was going to be taking on something like this, and if I was going to be contributing digitization expertise in terms of how to photograph and do the technical elements of this project, I wanted to make sure that we attended to what I thought were the obvious intellectual property issues, which we will go into shortly. I want to start though with a land acknowledgement for where we are. So the U of I Moscow is located on the homelands of the Nez Perce, the Palouse, and the Coeur d'Alene tribes. We extend gratitude to the Indigenous people that call this place home since time immemorial. U of I recognizes that it is our academic responsibility to build relationships with the Indigenous people to ensure integrity of tribal voices. This is from the U Idaho Tribal Relations Office. I have some different perspectives about land acknowledgements, but part of understanding tribal sovereignty is understanding that we have been provided this statement by Yolanda Bisbee, who is our director of our Tribal Relations Office, and we need to respect that just first and foremost. I like to think about what you can do beyond a land acknowledgement. I don't think it's satisfactory to acknowledge a theft and then not attempt to remedy that in some kind of meaningful way. So I'm always interested in conversations about how land acknowledgements can go beyond just what we have there. But for now, we're just going to leave this one here because that's its own complete presentation and a complex, nuanced topic on its own. And this photo on the right shows the landscape that this region's famous for, which is the Palouse, the rolling hills, and what are currently fertile farmlands. Okay, so next slide, please, Jylisa.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about our context. So the University of Idaho is an R2 land-grant university with modest funds when it comes to supporting research, especially research outside of the STEM disciplines, and modest funds as well in terms of salaries and wages for employees at all levels. We are considered to be the flagship research university for our state. And as Marco mentioned, we serve 5 federally recognized tribes of Idaho. In spring 2021, we received a Digitizing Hidden Collections grant from the Council on Library and Information Resources to digitize the Crabtree Lithic Comparative Collection. This grant provided us with $240,000 to do this work, and most of the funds from this grant are going towards paying our hired employees. So paying the salaries for Allison Fashing, our 3 student employees, Lee Sappington, and then buying out a very small percentage of Marco's time, my time, and Leah's time on this project. Our timeline for this grant is April 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2023. Because of some challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, receiving the technology that we had purchased, hiring employees, we'll likely seek a grant extension to make sure that we're able to complete this project and do everything that we had put into that original proposal. So a little bit about the Crabtree Collection. This collection includes approximately 8,000 lithic or stone tools that were created and collected by Crabtree throughout his lifetime. Approximately 10% of these are artifacts that were created by Native or Indigenous people. And unfortunately, the origin or provenance of these artifacts is currently unknown. Many of these artifacts were collected by Crabtree, We don't really know the story behind those, but it's very likely that he looted these from Native and Indigenous lands, or some of the colleagues that he worked with or people he engaged with in the general public did the same thing and found these objects, these artifacts, and then mailed them to Crabtree. We have the letters where these artifacts were included in a package, but there's no mention really of where they were found, who created these, or any acknowledgement of the fact that these are Native or Indigenous artifacts that were taken from the land where they were found. This collection also includes Crabtree's personal archives, so letters, holiday cards, conference speech transcripts, notes, drawings, photos, and slides. We're seeking to digitize those as well. The lithic or stone tools are mostly obsidian, which is volcanic glass, but some are made of other sources, including chert, flint, silt, and glass. Most of the tools, such as the obsidian or the glass, are incredibly shiny and some are transparent, which is a challenge for digitization that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So Crabtree is considered the dean of American flint knappers. We're still looking through his personal archives to see whether he bestowed that title on himself or if other people bestowed it upon him. We saw in his obituary that he was referred to that way, so we're trying to track down where that came from. And he received this title or bestowed it upon himself for his role creating and promoting the field of experimental lithics or experimental archaeology, which is where archaeologists or anthropologists try to recreate tools and objects from the past to understand how they were made and the process required for that work. As I mentioned, this is a 2-year grant, and in that time span, we're creating metadata, including item descriptions and technique notes. There's some basic metadata that already exists about this collection, and Lee Sappington, as Marco mentioned, is writing more contextual metadata that describes the processes used to actually create these tools and some of their history and Crabtree's work with them. So we're creating digital surrogates with photography and photogrammetry. So the photography is just 2D photos like the one you see on the slide here, and photogrammetry is used to create a 3D model. If you haven't heard of photogrammetry before, it's a process where an object is put on a stable base and kind of held there. And then the base rotates at a specific interval and a camera takes pictures at every different angle. You do that at different levels of the artifact or the object, and then you flip it over and do the same thing working back down. By taking pictures of multiple sides of an object, you're able to then stitch those together in 3D model creation software. We use Agisoft Metashape Professional to do that, and it generates a 3D model that maintains the actual color of the artifact itself. But one of the main grant components that was important for Marco and I from the very beginning, from when we were thinking about the application and as we were designing this, was to criticalize the collection with an advisory board and throughout the project. We're seeking to question the narratives and rhetoric surrounding this collection, narratives and rhetoric created by Crabtree himself, the people he worked with and interacted with, and by those who have engaged with this collection and even practiced flint knapping since. One way that we're doing this is through the idea of counter story, which was introduced by Solórzano and Yosso in 2002. We have taken a look at kind of their definition of counter story and reworked it a little bit to reflect the work that we do in libraries, archives, and special collections. So critically engaged counter-storying seeks to create new narratives to disrupt the existing, damaging standard rhetoric that contributes to the marginalization of oppressed people, rhetoric that is too often upheld and disseminated by mainstream archives, special collections, and libraries. Marco and I, throughout this project, have been talking around this idea, but it wasn't until a few months ago that we stumbled upon, or I stumbled upon this definition, which helped me conceptualize the work that we're actually doing, the rhetoric that we're bumping up against and that we're trying to change with this work. So what are some of our possibilities for counter story that we're trying to work with? One of them is Crabtree's myth of how he learned flint knapping. We've discovered 2 myths so far. The first one, which is what we used and based kind of our application upon, is Crabtree's own explanation that he learned flint knapping at the feet of Native Americans. And then who he discovered on, literally, in his words, the side of the road in Salmon, Idaho. The other myth that we discovered about 6 months ago, that was discovered by one of our student employees digitizing a journal entry of Crabtree, is that he just taught himself as a child. The quote that we found is, "When I was 7 years old, I became interested in hunting," I put in parentheses, AKA looting, "artifacts on the deserts of Idaho, and eventually became intrigued about their manufacture. I asked the local Indians for information, but they knew nothing of their fabrication. So I experimented with various percussion and pressure techniques until I was able to preform the lithic material." So we see two very different stories in both of these myths, but both of these myths center Crabtree as someone who had unique talents and knowledge that were so far above the Native and Indigenous people that he either said he learned from or who weren't able to help him at all, for him to then learn flint napping. So that these myths are centering Crabtree rather than the Native and Indigenous people who originally created these artifacts. Next, we have appropriation and anti-Indigenous erasure of knowledge and techniques. So you can see the quote that I just mentioned, as well as the fact that there's a lack of provenance attached to the Native and Indigenous items in this collection. There is no reference that we have found so far to the knowledge, techniques, and skills that Crabtree replicated, appropriated, and expanded upon as he was creating these lithic tools. There is no doubt that Crabtree was an artist who developed his own techniques and shared his knowledge, but we've yet to find examples in his written or spoken work where he credited or referenced, even generally, the Native and Indigenous intellectual property that he replicated and appropriated. Another possibility is to look at the artifacts created by Native and Indigenous people that have been deemed lost rather than stolen. Since the Native and Indigenous artifacts, as we've mentioned in this collection, have no provenance attached to them, they have been deemed lost by the Bowers Lab and by anthropology and archaeology as a discipline. This is a term that they use to talk about these artifacts or objects in collections that have no known provenance, when in fact, most, if not all, of this subset of artifacts were stolen from Native and Indigenous lands in the United States and around the world. These artifacts, as I said, were either found by Crabtree or others and mailed to them. So this word choice, this rhetoric, lost versus stolen, is something that Marco and I have recently really been talking about. We hadn't heard this term until we were doing a grant team meeting a few weeks ago. So this is something that we're just diving into right now. Lastly, we have the myth of Native extermination and replacement by Native emulators. One of our advisory board, Dr. Keisha Supernaut, said it best. The flint napping community in general is very white and very male. More often than not, these are the people whose flint napping videos you can find on YouTube, whose websites you can browse, whose objects you can purchase, and who you meet at these flint napping get-togethers. And disturbingly, a subset of this group also engages in selling looted Native and Indigenous artifacts online. So the centering of this white male perspective in the realm and in the practice of flint napping is erasing the Native and Indigenous people who are still engaged in that work. If you want to learn more about flint napping from a Native and Indigenous perspective, I encourage you to view this YouTube video. It's from the Visit Cherokee Nation YouTube channel. And Noelle Grayson is discussing the process and history behind the art form of flint napping. It's very engaging, and it's super interesting to see an expert such as Grayson start from a giant rock and flint nap it into a beautiful piece. So what are our limitations for counter story? There are multiple, and this is just a few listed on this slide. The first is that anthropology and archaeology have different approaches to this idea of counter story when compared to GLAM institutions. The knowledge and perspectives and prior experiences of our project collaborators are things that Marco and I have been working hard to navigate and negotiate. We're all coming from different spaces and have different perspectives around this issue, including Marco and myself. We're starting at very different places and very different knowledge levels. So it's a lot of working together and discussion. And our discipline kind of within libraries has made progress maybe in different ways than anthropology and archaeology and vice versa. So it's trying to navigate those differences. As I mentioned, there's a lack of information about the provenance for stolen items. So even if repatriation is a goal a large goal for this project or a pie in the sky goal, the opportunity for us to actually ever do that is going to be incredibly, incredibly challenging. Crabtree is a popular figure in flint napping and taught many Native people how to flint nap, creating a complex landscape of his relationship with this knowledge and how he shared it with others. Lastly, we're completing this project in an academic context and from a very scholarly way, when flint nappers themselves are more of a hobbyist practitioner group. So there's a disconnect between these two groups, and we're trying to bridge that gap as we create and facilitate these conversations. So I'm going to pass it on to Marco to talk a little bit more about our advisory board and how we're working with them to help us counterstory this collection.
Thanks so much, Jylisa. I was thinking about it, I feel like we're sort of missing a slide here where we should say, we decided to try to counterstory by creating an advisory board. But one of the things that we were aware of right off the bat was some of the potential problems that can happen with engaging folks, especially Native or other minoritized people in an advisory board context while working from a land-grant university. Some of the things that we've seen or are aware of is that it can be tokenizing. So it can be a way in which we ask people to have only a figurative participation and not have real authority over what's going to happen, the direction of the project or the content. And it can often be a way for the university or an institution to, I use the term brownwash, but really it could be in any kind of context. So to effectively, to give themselves an appearance of credibility that maybe they don't deserve, or in fact is partly trying to cover for some other issues that they're having. One of the things that's really challenged working in a land grant on a project like this is you don't have any clear way to know the existing relationship between your institution and the Native tribes and sovereign nations in your area unless you have talked to the right people and are in the know. And even then, if you're coming in from an outsider perspective, there's going to be sort of like an onion of information, right? Like different layers of information might be available to you. So you have to think about that broader context that you're operating in and what your university's particular relationship is looking like with both your regional tribal partners and then in our case, a sort of national view as well. Too often advisory boards can be really undercompensated for the work that's asked. They can ask people to do a lot of labor-intensive work that's also trauma ridden or trauma contextualized and just not appropriately compensated either in terms of the design of the labor or the actual money or remuneration for doing the work. Too often these spaces can expose people to micro and macro aggressions. I'm sure I don't need to go into that. I'm sure you can all imagine how that might manifest. Grant constraints can make implementing feedback challenging. If you haven't ever done a big grant like this before, this is my first one. We've applied for many grants on Chicana Madrasa, but never been successful and invited back to sort of iterative rounds of digitization, which is interesting just as an aside, because one of the criticisms we would receive on that project is that it was too narrowly focused because of its focus on Chicana feminism. And yet projects on singular people are funded all the time, right? So again, we see the sort of institutional factors happening there. But this is my first time with a big grant like this. And really, you have to plan out the majority of the work before you do it. Jylisa and I really had to stretch a lot of our technical skills and know how to do this project. And I don't think, just to speak for both of us, I don't think either of us were prepared for how much of that would have to be done in advance of ever actually receiving the grant. So this happens to be one of those ones that just has a really intensive process. I think there's been a lot of advantages to that for us in some ways, because we came into it a lot more ready than we would have been and thinking about all of that pre-work that we did writing the grant. But then you can think about how that causes problems when you bring in an advisory board and you do want them to have actual meaningful impact and direction over the project. How can you do that when you've also literally had to plan your project out? I mean, literally to the week. You have job descriptions written, you have money already allotted for how it's going to be spent. And so, we've had to really think about making sure that we're very honest with our advisory board about what we can and can't do and how much change we can and can't implement in the project. And I think that that's been something where it's just been important to be radically honest about that and to try to be very pragmatic and grounded too. It can also be challenging to identify the right potential members for an advisory board. One of the things you'll run into working with Native nations is sovereignty issues, in the sense that, not everyone is qualified to speak on everything for a Native nation, right? Just as I'm not qualified to speak on behalf of the United States about really anything. People can ask me for my opinion as an American citizen, but I'm not able to represent us in meaningful engagement or negotiations with other institutions or nations. So that can be a challenge to think about when you're working with a Native advisory board, especially one where you're trying to get some kind of either official sign off on something or just personal opinion. And I think that's also where we had to be clear with our advisory board members that our ask here is for people to sort of review and critique our process from a more personal and scholarly perspective. We are not in any capacity able to say, or even wanting to say, that these folks are speaking for their tribal affiliations. They're not. They're here to advise as experts. And with that, we should probably go into who those folks are. Let's just jump ahead to that slide if you don't mind. Yeah, so these are going to be our advisory board members. I just want to bring them up sooner rather than later so you can see who we decided to select for this. And so basically we ended up with a kind of snowball sample survey where we also specifically focused on Native identified people working in GLAM. So galleries, libraries, archives, and museum. And we put together a kind of open call, which then we sent out to folks from a curated list that we had put together, looking in different Indigenous information science spaces, archaeology and architecture, or excuse me, archaeology and anthropology spaces, and other folks working in tribal like curation, cultural curation or cultural heritage. So Larissa McLeod, Dr. Richie Myers, Angie Neller, Dr. Bonnie Newson, Dr. Keisha Supernott, Dr. Jason Younker, and Mandy Harris, our advisory board. And these folks represent a variety of institutions and regions. So we have folks who are in Canada, specifically Alberta. We have Richie joining us from South Dakota, I believe it is. Mandy is our graduate student representation on this. And so we're trying to cast kind of a wide net here. So let's go ahead and jump back a couple of slides now, if you don't mind, Jylisa. Thank you so much. So part of what we're trying to do with this team of folks is do something that addresses those issues that I mentioned in the, the trouble with advisory boards. So we're trying to provide excellent compensation and making sure there are also social and professional benefits to the work. For us, excellent compensation look like offering, I believe it's $2,500. Is that right, Jylisa? For what we're hoping is about 5 to 10 hours of work. And the work itself looks like an interview with us, which we're going to talk more about in just a little bit. It's not a labor-focused format, so we're not saying review individual items. Shout out to Shannon Smith saying Mandy is great. Mandy Harris is great. She's definitely an upcoming scholar in Indigenous Kids Lit and Indigenous ways of knowing in Kids Lit. So you should keep an eye out on her. She will be big on the scene in no time. And so that's a great point. We partly, like Mandy, we wanted to bring her in and make sure that she was able to make connections with the other folks who are on our advisory board, who are sort of further along in their career and might be folks she wants to collab with in different ways. And so we made sure to convene group spaces where everyone got to meet each other, as well as doing the individual interviews. It's not a labor-focused format, so people are just asked to contribute their expertise, and we ask them to contribute in the way that they prefer. We're minimizing harm and the possibility of micro and macroaggressions by having this basically be a closed conversation. So the advisory board is answering questions from Jylisa and me about the project in terms of things where we want advice, but then it's a lot of us just saying, what do you think about this? And sort of opening the floor and listening to what folks have to say. And it's a closed meeting with just us and the advisory board. And then we share out to our grant team from there. We do our best to have accountability by being transparent and honest and trying to implement feedback even when difficult. This has been something that's been a lot of energy, especially for me as the only brown person on this project. And so we have been trying to do our best to make sure that we have a truly anti-racist praxis happening in our lab as much as we can manage, and then trying to foreground that sovereignty throughout. So understanding what capacity are people speaking from, and also understanding that if people don't want to interact with the advisory board, that's totally okay. We've asked some regional partners if they wanted to participate, and they didn't reply to us. And we have accepted that as a no for now, and have also left a spot open because we understand, again, that we are not in any position to make an ask upon a sovereign nation of which our university owes a lot. Next slide, please, Jylisa. So we've had to go through a lot of iterations to get to this concept. We initially started with, I think Jylisa and I had kind of a misunderstanding about this collection and thought that it was a lot more indigenous artifacts than it was. And we're hoping that repatriation and reprovincing would be part of the work, and have since learned the ways in which that's kind of impossible. And so that obviously changed the iteration of our advisory board concept. We had also then thought about a more local advisory board and ran into the aforementioned challenge that I just mentioned. And so we had to go through several different iterations to figure out what did people actually want to engage with us with on this, and what was maybe wrong in our original ask or conception of the idea. Our process centers personal autonomy and tribal sovereignty. It's that snowball sample, as I mentioned, and it was a collaborative one-on-one sign-up process. What we mean by this is that we actually had people talk with us on Zoom for 30 minutes to an hour before they committed, just so they could ask us all of the questions that they might want to ask and kind of check us out and see if they were comfortable engaging with us at the level that we're at. And we also made sure that, if folks didn't email us back, we took, we sent one polite follow-up email and then took that as a no, right? And so really trying to, I think sometimes there's an urge for us to get kind of colonial about it and be like, we've got this clear grant and we've got to deliver an advisory board. And, and it's like, anytime that would pop up would be like, we can't do this way, because we're trying to do this in the right way in terms of how we do it, not just the outcome. And so my perspective has always been, if the advisory board fails because we couldn't do it the right way, then that's better than doing it the wrong way, right? So I think that's been kind of one of our guiding cornerstones that we've come back to. And then we co-created the interviews, which Jylisa, I think, is going to be able to tell you about in a little bit more detail shortly. So we already introduced our fabulous team here. But again, just to sort of highlight those folks, we're deeply grateful to them for agreeing to collaborate with us on this, and all the expertise they've already shared in our informal conversations, and then the folks that we've started to have interviews with. Okay, so some of the topics and ideas we've had so far about what we're going to do is we're doing these one-on-one interviews as discussed, which is just basically about an hour-long Zoom over 6 or 7 questions, which we've co-created with the person we're interviewing. And then we're going to post those interviews on our ultimate website that shows our digitized collection, as well as some written content about some of the issues we're talking about today. We're also having some other ideas that have come up collaboratively in these advisory board spaces. So one idea is a podcast or even a conference panel among members to talk about the many issues typified by a collection like the Crabtree Collection, specifically the appropriation of Indigenous knowledges and the ways in which we need to extend decolonizing beyond just thinking about specifically native belongings, but also thinking about the ways in which things are appropriative or extractive. Digitization is not repatriation, right? So that's a topic that we've also been talking about quite a bit in the advisory board. Is, does sharing the stolen belongings in the Crabtree Collection help them ultimately get repatriated? Is the university actually willing to follow through on that? And if it's not, do we change what we do in terms of how we want to share them? Is this project able to help facilitate the return of looted items? One of the things Jason Younker said in his interview is that we should be taking like 100 years approach, or hundreds of years, thinking about what's the impact of the work that we're doing now looking forward. Jylisa will, I think, share that probably in his own words much more eloquently than I put it. But thinking about that here, like, does what we're doing now help repatriation in the future? Thinking about, is it okay to treat items with invasive processes, and then creating spaces for native anthropology, archaeology, and GLAM expertise, which I think I've already touched upon. I want to come back to this considering what items are okay to treat just briefly before I turn us back over to Jylisa. Yes, so basically, if you're not familiar, And this is a whole other conference presentation effectively, so I'm going to make this very compact, but reach out with questions. Normally, if you're scanning things that are very shiny, especially in archaeology, what they do is they spray them with what's called a developer spray or even a foot spray, and it creates just a dull finish on the object, which makes it easier to photogrammetry. And that's because photogrammetry looks for minor contrast between light sources, light reflected on an object. And so something that's super shiny really confuses it, and you end up with an object that has like big holes in it, or it can't align because it doesn't understand the way the pieces go together. We didn't want to use those processes because they sound terrible. The stuff is really expensive, and it's also super toxic. If you're doing it in like a true OSHA approved way, you need to have like serious filtration and really serious mask filtration. I mean, much more so than even KN95, like, serious filtration. And we wanted something else. So we came up with a method of dipping things in Elmer's glue, which creates a matte finish and then can obviously be easily removed, as anyone who's ever put Elmer's glue on their hand and then peeled it off knows. So this was a great success for us. We were super excited about it. We were super excited about the accessibility elements of this, about having a process that's so much less toxic. But then one of our advisory board members, Angie Neller, who's at the Wanapum Heritage Center, she said, this is great. And also, I really want you guys to be conscious about how you share this out, because if you just say really uncritically, like, we invented this thing and it's great and you should do it, she's like, people are going to run around and just, ruin all kinds of native artifacts that still have forensic data to be recovered on them. And so in our case, that really helped us to provide a lot of caveats. Next slide, please, Jylisa. So this is an example from a presentation we gave earlier this year. And it's where we're saying, honestly, you shouldn't use this in like 85% of your contexts. It's really only in a situation where you were already going to do something like foot spray on something, which in our case, we're saying is not acceptable to do to any of the indigenous belongings in the collection. So Crabtree's collection was intended to be experimental. There is no forensic value to be derived from it ever. But in our opinion, Jylisa and mine, as librarians, we think that we should do the most conservative measures for any of the indigenous native stolen belongings in the collection. So this is an example of how our advisory board helped us to really highlight something critical here, and she used some of her knowledge, both in a native context, but also in a cultural heritage curator context, to say, I know what people are going to do if you don't present this carefully and in the right context. Next slide, please. All right, so with that, we'll turn it over to Jylisa, and she's going to tell you about that interview progress.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Marco. So far, this slide is wrong. We actually have scheduled 6 of our 7 advisory board members scheduled those interviews. We scheduled the 6th yesterday for early December. Our first interview that we've completed was with Dr. Jason Younker, and that was in mid-October. So the format for these interviews are video and audio, recorded via Zoom. And we're trying to utilize Zoom's live transcript and closed captions to create an initial transcript of the interview. That was less successful than we were hoping for. So we will likely need to share that audio with a transcription service and pay for an actual transcription with timestamps to make sure that that can be posted on the website and available with either the video or the audio. So the interviewee will decide which version is available on the project website. If they want the entire recorded Zoom video, we'll post that. If they just want the audio, we'll post that. One of our board members, Dr. Bonnie Newsom, brought up the potential, or asked whether there would be expiration or reevaluation dates connected to this interview content. This was brought up through our discussion of the fact that a lot of our ideas around these topics might change over time, and the need to ensure that when people's ideas or perspectives change, that something like this just isn't living out there if they've come to a different realization regarding some aspect of the project or their own work that they discussed. So we're going to be working with our advisory board to discuss that potential for an expiration or reevaluation date for that content. For the interview, we have 5 base questions that all of our advisory board members will be asked, with additional questions related to their expertise, either in archaeology or anthropology, and libraries and archives and curation, etc. We're sharing the questions approximately 2 weeks prior to the interview and asking interviewees to suggest their own questions or change the questions as they see fit. So on this slide are our 5 initial questions. It's asking our interviewees to share their perspective on this collection and ones like it. Is it appropriative of Native cultures? Whether folks digitizing collections who are not anthropologists should take up this type of contextualizing work that we're doing. What makes a digital effort like this a good partner to Native nations and people? What should people know about flint knapping, that process of making those lithic tools or artifacts? What should they know to understand the art and practice in a way that doesn't center this one non-Native person, Crabtree? And then one of the topics we've discussed is a relationship between experimental archaeology, amateur archaeology, and cultural, as well as knowledge appropriation. So just having them talk about the relationship between those concepts. When we interviewed Dr. Jason Younker, we developed another question that grew out of that initial one-on-one meeting that Marco and I held with Dr. Younker to talk more about the advisory board and what the work would look like and whether he was interested in answering his questions. As we've discussed, the Crabtree Collection includes objects that Crabtree created, as well as objects created by Native and Indigenous people that he or those who knew him looted. What options are there for discovering the geological provenance of Native belongings, especially when any residues have not been preserved? Dr. Younker brought up this idea that there are options to potentially take samples of the Native and Indigenous artifacts and then examine them to try to get a geological location or geographic location where those artifacts might have came from, what the source of the actual stone was. One of the challenges that he brought up with this type of process is that just because we know where the stone or the material came from, we can't make an automatic connection to it was the Native and Indigenous people in those areas who created the specific artifact. That stone might have been traded to another part of the world or another part of the country. So things like geological provenance are a step in a potential direction to learning more about these artifacts, but not the be-all end all to determining who actually created them. I'm just going to share a couple of quotes from Dr. Jason Younker to demonstrate kind of what we're learning from these interviews and how our advisory board is collaborating with us to counterstory this collection. So when we were asking Dr. Younker about experimental archaeology and amateur or avocational archaeology and the relationship between that, he shared a very interesting perspective. I'm just going to read the bolded portion. Because he said, I have a problem, so I have no problem with people replicating. I have a problem with people appropriating and saying that they are experts, that these avocational archaeologists or these flint knappers are experts in this process, when really they are replicating thousands of years of technology. We asked what people might do or what suggestions Dr. Younker might have to assist people who might be avocational archaeologists or flint knappers. And he suggested he would encourage these individuals to think about these things being easily replicated, but thinking a little bit more about the knowledge required to kind of understand this and the knowledge that came before those individuals who are doing the flint knapping right now. And what's really interesting as we look at this quote is that this is Dr. Younker's perspective. Our other advisory boards might say, advisory board members might say something completely different. They might say something like replicating is appropriation, whether or not they call themselves an expert, that avocational archaeology or amateur archaeology is appropriative and completely dangerous for the profession and for maybe the groups or communities that these individuals are engaging with. So our next quote from Dr. Jason Younker is related to what Marco mentioned before about when we are working with Native and Indigenous people and Native and Indigenous nations, we're building on relationships that need to last for hundreds of years. So we're thinking about this in the context of a digital collection. Oftentimes when we digitize these collections, they're put online, we might continue to update them, but the relationships that formed when we created them are kind of over when the project is over. But when we're doing this type of work with this collection, or when other people are doing this work and engaging with Native and Indigenous partners, it's necessary to look ahead. He said, now we have to figure out what is best for not only the collections, but the community that we've created that relationship with. So that in itself, I think, should be considered whenever you're looking at collections or Indigenous knowledge that is intended to be preserved. And it is there as a resource for future generations, those who we have not yet met. That is truly the goal of the library, is continuing these relationships and continuing this partnership and work together. Okay, so I think this is passing on to Marco.
Thank you, Jylisa. And I just wanted to say thank you, Naomi, for that great link. I tried to type you out a quick answer there, but when we do some discussion, feel free to chime in because I would love to continue that. So looking beyond Crabtree, some questions to consider. We're trying to think about what's the applicability for this for other folks. And so for us, some of the early takeaways we have are, how do the collections you might be working to digitize replace and uphold white supremacy and colonization? I think we've thought about this some in the content of our digitization projects and have sought to include more diversity, but I don't think we've necessarily done very much to criticalize the existent white collections or things from colonizers like Crabtree, who are receiving a lot of benefit from appropriation without very much accountability in how it's presented. And so for us, a big goal was not to present Crabtree the way he has been previously, which is pretty uncritical and venerating of his work. So some other questions are, what interventions can be taken when you look into those collections? And some things to consider are, and of course, these are common counter story points, is how can you make visible the voices, stories, and histories that have actively been lost and ignored visible? How can you highlight them? How can you make them visible? Also, how can you make sure those stories are being told ideally by the people who those stories represent? If that's not possible, how do you sort of reconcile the difference between where you are and who should be speaking on it? How may your personal and professional identities affect how you story collections? What will you do to ensure both personal accountability and project accountability? So these are some of the questions we've been grappling with. I don't know that we have easy answers for anyone, but for those who are thinking like, well, what's the practical takeaways for someone in a collection or taking up a project? This is a rubric that we're sort of brainstorming and thinking about. With that, I believe, Jylisa, can we go to the next slide? We do have a little bit of time for discussion questions today. So if you go to mentimeter.com or menti.com as shown, menti.com, and use the code 57629162, you can put in your answers to these questions, and you will be able to see that. Jylisa, maybe I can take over the screen share for that once we give people a chance to filter over. I'm going to just punch those codes into the chat real quick. And I think this is also a small enough group that we could skip the Mentimeter if folks want to do that. We weren't sure what size we were going to have. So basically, we just kind of wanted to have a space to talk about these questions. So I'm not sure. Jylisa, do you have thoughts? Should we go over to Mentimeter and let people participate anonymously, or do we want to facilitate it through Zoom? We've got about 10, 12 minutes here.
Let's do both. If people want to unmute and talk about, answering those questions, and we can look at that, or they can ask us other questions. So whichever way people want to participate. Okay, that sounds good. All right, so folks, let me know if you have any trouble accessing this, and if a brave soul can volunteer and try it out. Can you think of a recent digital project you work on that might benefit from critical counter story, and what stories would you want to tell? And potentially, I know like before this project, I never really worked on a digital collections type project. So you can replace recent digital project with maybe the type of work you do, maybe a collection development project, maybe developing a lesson plan for a course. So change that little portion to whatever is most applicable to your work specifically. Good call, Jylisa. Okay. All right, we got no takers on this question. Do the I forget what that pause is called in education philosophy, but it's where you let the silence extend for a bit to see. Digitizing a women's suffrage manuscript collection. Excellent. Thank you. Participant number one, my hero. That's a great collection. I'm wondering, yeah, Bren, feel free to jump in. I see a raised hand up there.
It's not digital, but we're trying to diversify our children's books collection for our early childhood and education program.
That's a good one, Bren. How are you taking that on?
We're starting with print, and we're going to like the Malika, not Malika, I've got Wilbur on my brain. Sorry, but we're going to small businesses to find own voices, publishers, and authors. And we're trying to sort of develop it. I live in Los Angeles, so we're starting in our local community and going to book fairs, festivals that we wouldn't necessarily even know about otherwise. So we're trying to educate ourselves about what's available out there in order to bring that forward for our instructors in that program and for our students. We just opened a lab for our early childhood education program, and so this is going to be featured in that lab.
Oh, wow. Well, Brent, I could go on a whole different presentation with you about that. I redid some of our collections at the Curriculum Center because when I came in, we had sort of like basically a Cowboys and Indians collection. And I was like, this is a disaster. And that approach that you outlined there is just great. Like going to those small independent publishers, that definitely helped me in terms of rounding out the collection and just thinking about what might be available in Los Angeles is like really exciting. So please feel free to send me an email about that. I would actually love to have like a Zoom and a conversation with you about that too. Because yeah, Kids Lit and the potential and need to counter story the dominant narrative is really potent stuff. Some other folks have put in some great responses in here that I want to highlight too. Someone says, I'm a health literacy librarian and would like to see how many lesson plans can utilize critical counter stories. This is such a great topic too. I was doing a health myth promotion class, a misinformation session, and folks didn't know about the Tuskegee experiments. And so I'm always amazed at what people do and don't know about, especially when it comes to minoritized or marginalized identities and the way those histories are sort of kept out of dominant narratives and how many people who don't have those identities are just completely unaware. So great ideas there. Jylisa, is there anything in here that you want to highlight and pull out? I don't want to hog all the question answering here.
I mean, I think all of these projects sound fascinating. Particularly the one for the Southwest Films, where the River Runners documented Indigenous peoples, events, and places, and being uncertain about whether something was actually collaborative or extractive, because that's something that we're working with too, and especially with looking at the letters that Crabtree wrote and that he received and the work he did teaching Native and Indigenous people about flint knapping, is it's this really weird situation where we're not really sure what's going on. So that sounds fascinating, is seeking kind of the counter story for that project that you're working on and trying to figure out what actually happened and what are the avenues for discovering that. It sounds challenging and fascinating.
Yeah, I think another really good point that makes me think of, I mean, at least I hope it's a good point, is I think it's important to be humble and say, you know, to not let like your white shame get the best of you and say, well, we shouldn't even present these to the Native people who are possibly represented or impacted in this collection because we don't want to be harmful. And so I think it's actually great to say, like, we're aware that this, series of films could be extractive or could be appropriative or could be racist in the ways in which people are depicted. But we're also aware of that this is not just our history to decide what to do with. And so that we want to bring in the relevant parties to contribute expertise and viewpoints to help us contextualize it, but also so that they can benefit back, So I think that would be really fascinating, that project, if you could get set up with some of the right cultural heritage partners to think about what you might do with film like that, and the way, people are always curious to see ancestors in previous times in different contexts. I think it really just becomes about how is it presented and is it contextualized about the things with it that are problematic. So this is great. All right, well, let's go on to our next question. I do also just want to highlight the other folks who put in responses here. A digitized collection of writers' correspondence of a wealthy white American woman who discusses her Filipino servants in a dismissive way would benefit from a counter story discussing American colonialism in the Philippines. I think that's true. And also, I always caution starting, it's very challenging when you're starting from a place where people are being actively traumatized or oppressed in a narrative. And so thinking about how to trouble that as well and make sure that we don't replicate any of that. Okay, so one of our next questions that we had was, this will go forward for me. What challenges or limitations do you see with this approach? I'm just going to pull up chat. And I also just want to acknowledge in chat for the person who asked the medical question that someone has provided you a great resource and referral link in there. And while folks, if you feel like putting your answers into this Mentimeter prompt, go ahead. I think since we only have 5 minutes here too, it's a great time to say if folks have any free-form questions or any other questions they want to ask about this project, please feel free to drop those in the chat, raise your hand. And thank you so much to everyone who came and your participation so far. Hey, Bren, jump in there.
Sorry, I think for us, the biggest difficulty has been connecting with other people doing the same work. So that's why I'm really glad that we're having this conference and that we're having this discussion.
Yes, and the Curriculum Center, I mean, I know you're not exactly in that context, but the youth lit libraries, you often do, I think in an academic context, feel sort of like you're operating in a vacuum. And so I'm really looking to public libraries for a lot of leadership on that. So it is true. It's really great, these conference spaces, to bring us all together. Someone says the limits are our existing archive and not wanting new questions to perpetuate tokenizing. And so I think maybe what this person means is that your current archive is maybe not representative or is limited in the way it's representative. And you don't want to get into the sort of brown washing or, you know, putting a veneer of social justice on it. And I think that that's a great point and a perpetual risk, and one where you have to have that accountability to make sure that you aren't succumbing to that. I think you can even have something where you've tried to design around that and then still notice the drift. I forget the exact quote from Bell Hooks, but it's, you know, basically that white supremacy is prevalent and constant and manifests constantly in our society. And so even in your little grant project, when you're trying really hard not to manifest it, it's still going to manifest. And so I think it's partly like, what is the strategy when it shows up and what are you going to do about it? And how is the harm minimized for marginalized people, hopefully, and harm is impactful in ways for, you know, just really trying to minimize that impact as much as possible. Yeah, so someone points out visibility. So content warnings and positionality statements can only go so far when these problematic materials still exist and can be engaged. Material acquisition from underrepresented groups is what I want to see. I agree with this point. I used to work at Michigan State, where we had a big collection of white supremacy materials in our special collections. And it was alarming to know that and see that people were coming in and scanning those materials and then disseminating them in BIPOC spaces around campus, both there and at UMich. So it's, you know, those positionality statements. Yeah, it's also where do you put the money? What gets digitized? What gets put out there? Jylisa, do you have any thoughts you want to share on any of these points?
No, I think you covered those great.
All right, well, I'm going to acknowledge we got about 2 minutes here. Just the general proper support for the time it takes to do this work well. Yeah, that's it's a good point and a big challenge. Hopefully this inspires folks who are interested in work like this and working on grants to try to write it in as much as they can. We definitely should have written in a lot more time for the grant in general, and this part specifically. It would be nice to not have to minimize other things to make sure this gets the time it needs. What you can't do is minimize this though, because then you're doing a white supremacy again, and we're trying not to do that. Someone mentioned, Naomi says, legal frameworks and tribal law would be good to use for a Crabtree collection, explaining some of the laws about archaeology and cultural property to people viewing the collections. Yeah, that's a great point, Naomi. And I think that that's one of the things we're hoping to bring out in some of our interviews with our advisory board members, and also in some of the written content we're going to create for the site, talking about like collecting artifacts off the land as looting, and citing some of those both existing laws and also challenging the sort of cultural norms about casual theft. So someone says, I just want to comment that connecting these challenges to misinformation, especially in health, is something I'm hearing for the first time. The NNLM is hosting a symposium on health misinformation in April, and I hope this topic may have a chance to be presented. Oh, thank you very much. That's a very kind remark, Cecilia. Let me know if you ever want to connect about that, because as I mentioned, I do those health misinformation lectures as well as part of my liaison work. And so lots of convergence in topics here. Okay, well, thank you so much. You guys have been a wonderful audience. Please have a great rest of your conference. Thank you for joining us bright and early. Jylisa and I are here if you have more questions and would like to connect. Thank you especially to everyone who shared resources and ideas. We will look at those closely and follow up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I'm gonna, it looks like you already paused or stopped the recording, so I'll have it saved and sent out.